Welcome to this introduction to Herman Dooyeweerd's Roots of Western Culture. Its Dutch title was Renewal and Reflection, and I think if you combine those two titles then you'll get a good sense of what Dooyeweerd was hoping to achieve. In this video I'm just going to introduce you to the historical background to the book and begin to get stuck into the first few pages. Two figures loom large in the background to Dooyeweerd's contribution, and indeed loom large to the background of Dutch society at the beginning of the 20th century. The first is Groven van Prinsterer, who became concerned with politics in the Netherlands and in particular the ideas of the French Revolution. In his analysis he came to an understanding that the principles and ideas behind the French Revolution were deeply anti-Christian and were having a major influence on modern society, and therefore required a deep, thorough kind of spiritual analysis and a comprehensive response from Christians. After he died, Abraham Kuyper kind of took the lead in this anti-revolutionary movement, and in 1878 he reorganized it into a political party. In 1880 he established a university in Amsterdam called the Free University. He also wrote regularly for both the daily and weekly newspaper. And so in effect, Abraham Kuyper was the chief organizer and spokesman for the influence of Christian ideas and principles in the Netherlands. And he reached the height of his fame and influence in 1901 when he became the Prime Minister and served as the Prime Minister of the Netherlands until 1905. One great quote of Abraham Kuyper that sums up his vision of Christianity as something much more than a narrow religious approach to life or a set of theological doctrines was when he opened his university in 1880, and he made this declaration that there is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry mine. And this was a kind of ringing declaration that sort of stands for Kuyper's vision. The idea of the antithesis is very important for von Prinsterer and Kuyper, and it's also a central theme in Dooyeweerd's Roots. So I thought I'd give a little bit of background to this idea. The word antithesis just means opposition, and throughout the Bible there is the reality of two opposite directions. One for good, which is linked in with redemption, and one for evil, which is linked into the fall and sin. So we go right back to the beginning where we have the account of the fall in Genesis 3, then we're told that there will be enmity between the serpent and the woman and between their offspring. And within that verse, you can look it up, there's also the hope for that the offspring of the woman will eventually overcome the evil and bring about redemption. The theme of opposing directions is also very strong in Deuteronomy, which is the book of the covenant. So the commands and promises that God gives to the Israelites, and in chapters 27 and 28 we get the blessings and curses that are linked to obedience and disobedience to the commandments of the covenant. Also in the Psalms there is the theme of the way of the righteous and the way of the wicked, which is nicely introduced at the beginning of in Psalm 1, so you can have a look at that. Proverbs, we also get this opposition between wisdom and folly, the wise and the foolish. I'm not going to go through all of these, but an interesting example in the New Testament, you can have a look at other examples, is in Matthew 20, where Jesus is talking to his disciples and says, "Not so with you," which gives an idea of an opposition, that there's a difference in the way he expects his disciples to live their lives. So maybe for a bit of homework you might want to have a look up Matthew 20, 25 and 27, and perhaps think about other places in the Bible where this opposition between good and evil is kind of highlighted. Herman Dooyeweerd grew up in an environment greatly influenced by Abraham Kuyper. He studied at the Free University in Amsterdam, the university that Kuyper had founded, studying law. He graduated in 1917, then worked for local government for a few years, and then in 1922 he was appointed the first director of the Kuyper Institute, which had been founded to promote Christian reflection on Christian principles and applications in politics. Then in 1926 he became Professor of Jurisprudence back at the Free University of Amsterdam. Then after the war, in August of 1945, he took up the responsibility to be the editor of a new weekly newspaper called The New Netherlands, and it's from articles in this paper that the contents of Roots of Western Culture come. I'm going to give an overview of the first few pages of Roots and then focus in on one or two issues. So Dooyeweerd begins with some quite generous quotes from a recently issued manifesto. I think it was issued in May of that year. Dooyeweerd is writing at the end of August, by the Dutch national movement. Dooyeweerd takes it very seriously. He recognises the sincerity and earnestness of the manifesto and wants to take it seriously. He notes maybe two key things about it. One is that in its call for unity and spiritual reflection, it says that the politics before the war has to be put to one side, in particular some of the principles. The Marxists had their principle of class struggle and the Christians had their principle of antithesis. And both Marxists and Christians had worked together in the underground in the resistance during the Second World War, and they needed to continue in that spirit of working together and putting aside their differences. And the second thing that's perhaps noticeable is that a kind of a new basis in which they can cooperate, which the manifesto calls personalistic socialism. And this raises the question for Dooyeweerd, well, how should Christians respond to this call to put aside the principle of antithesis? He says, well, the Christians could just put the burden of proof back on the Dutch national movement and say, okay, how is your personalistic socialism going to work, and how is that going to unite the country? But Dooyeweerd says this is not a healthy attitude, and instead he wants to think through and reflect on the nature of the antithesis. Is this a living principle? Does it have, he talks about, does it have spiritual vitality, or is it just a slogan that can be put to one side? He then discusses some key points about the meaning of the antithesis and asks some questions about the nature of this principle. And then the final section here in the introduction, he makes a distinction between genuine and superficial dialogue as a way for thinking about how the discussion should continue. I've decided to focus on a bit about what Dooyeweerd says about the antithesis, and then a little bit about the idea of a genuine dialogue. So on page 3, Dooyeweerd says, what are we to say? Amidst the ruins of our nation's existence and the rubble of Western civilization, it is hardly fitting for us to beat the drums. Surely this is not the time for the proponents of the antithesis to sound the battle cry. So that's how he starts this little section where he's discussing the antithesis. I think there's some quite interesting and quite powerful writing in my view anyway. I'm just going to bring out these three things. First of all, the antithesis is something that is deep. What I mean by that is it's not something on the surface. We could perhaps think of what God says to the prophet Samuel in 1 Samuel 16 verse 7, where he talks about that people look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So when Dooyeweerd's view of the antithesis is that it's about the heart, it's about something quite deep. The second point that Dooyeweerd makes quite powerfully, I think, is that the antithesis is not something that divides people into groups. It's not a division that cuts one set of people off from another. Rather, it actually cuts through the heart. It cuts through each community and each person themselves. And I think there's some interesting points that he says there. And then the last thing is that he raises two questions over on the next page, on page 4. He asks about what is the scope of this principle of the antithesis? How broad is it? How wide is it? And he also asks what its nature is. Is it just something historical? Is it something that passes away? Is it something that's transient? So there's some things that we can think about the antithesis. The last section of Dooyeweerd's introduction is called Genuine and Superficial Dialogue, and I think this is a really interesting sentence, which is the very last sentence of this section. It says, "It is the way of self-examination and not the way of abstract theoretical inquiry." Now, it might be helpful to know that Dooyeweerd's kind of great philosophical work is quite a massive 3-volumed work called The New Critique of Theoretical Thought. And one of Dooyeweerd's key ideas is that theory has its own unique character, which means it has its own unique contribution to make, but it also means that it needs to be understood as having its own limits. And that's going to be an important theme that comes through also in chapter 1. But it's the first part of the sentence that I want to focus on at the moment, the idea of the way of self-examination, or if you like, self-reflection. Although the title Roots of Western Culture wasn't given by Dooyeweerd, it was actually Renewal and Reflection. But the idea of roots fits in very well with how Dooyeweerd thinks and what he wants to say, because the roots go underground, they draw on the nutrients to make something living. And this is what Dooyeweerd wants to analyze, the roots of Western culture. But the roots of Western culture are also our own roots, and they're kind of linked into our own sort of personal spiritual motivation. So I want to make a suggestion that as we read through Dooyeweerd's analysis, we can test his analysis not just against what people have said or what's happened in history or how culture and society is shaped, but we can also test it to some extent through a kind of self-reflection. Is what Dooyeweerd is saying and analysing, does it uncover something about ourselves, about what motivates us in how we live, what shapes our own thoughts and feelings and actions in the world? So I think it's quite an interesting quote to finish off this introduction.